Forestry for a sustainable future.
Forestry called the Swedish model.
Ethical and sustainable forestry.
A protected water area.
Binds more carbon dioxide.
Constantly expanding growth and sustainability at the same time.
Thanks to the forestry industry. Climate-friendly heat and energy. Climate-friendly products.
Sustainable fuel.
And endangered species where the future grows. This is good for the climate.
Sustainable bioenergy.
Bioplastic.
Renewable.
Green fuels. Houses.
Nature.
Furniture.
Packaging.
Clothes.
Nobody has shown that it is a sustainable forestry.
I think the industry has found it very convenient to perpetuate this myth that bioenergy doesn't have a net impact on the atmosphere.
The situation is not getting better, it's actually getting worse over time.
Den här stora syntesen var ju egentligen inledningen på ett enormt lobbyarbete.
Skogsbruket i Sverige idag, som det är utformat, utgör det enskilt största hotet mot miljön i Sverige.
The so-called Swedish forestry model is promoted all over the world as a success story. In times of climate change, the forest industry claim to hold the magic wand: wood. Wood is to be used for everything from packaging, makeup and clothing to fuel for an ever-expanding transport sector. To push this narrative, they spend millions and millions on advertising, public relations and lobbying. In this film, with the help of independent scientists and experts, we will examine some of their claims. Because if these are not true, continuing and spreading the Swedish forestry model could jeopardize the climate and the ecosystems on which we all depend. Many people think that a forest is a large collection of trees, but a forest is more than just trees. A natural forest consists of all the species above and below ground, plants, huge fungal networks, animals, and the interaction between them. Trees are born, they live, die, and provide homes to countless organisms. Sweden harbours an important part of Europe's last remaining natural forests, which have never been clear-cut, so-called continuity forests or ancient woodlands. But Europe's natural heritage is threatened. Every year, the area of continuity forest shrinks in Sweden. That's because both non-certified and also PEFC and FSC certified forest owners continue to clear-cut and destroy valuable natural forests without caring for the consequences for the ecosystems. Few people who hear about the Swedish forestry model are fully aware of how it works. To summarise, it's more like tree agriculture. Older forests are clear-cut and the ground is often harrowed. The most common regeneration method is to plant pre-grown seedlings. After some time, the stands are thinned, and when the trees are considered ready, they are clear-cut again.
Especially during the 1900s, we have had a major transition of the Swedish forest, and that is because we have started with what we usually call modern forestry. And this is a technical forestry, and it's moving the forest towards more an agricultural-like state, where we not only harvest trees, but we also manipulate the ecosystem in order to increase the production of the forest. And we have been doing ditching on a large scale of forest land. We have been using herbicides, we have been clear-cutting, and we are lowering the total age to the forest. And we are having the same species and the same age of forest in separate stands, which was never the case before, where we had landscape covering forest with trees in different species and trees in different age classes all over the forest landscape.
Forest ecologist and expert in geographical information systems, Dr. Jan Andersson, has visualised the dramatic change in Swedish taiga since the 1950s.
The study area is located here in northern part of Sweden, in Västerbotten County. And it covers roughly 17,000 square kilometers. So these green areas, it is forest that has not previously been clear-cut at this time. And the yellow patches, it is clear-cuts. These small black lines, it is logging roads. These gray areas, these are impediments. So forest is not growing there by definition. Now see here came a very big nature reserve, but if you remember here, it is mostly Myers actually. The same goes for this one. So these patches covers the entire area, but the entire area is not covered by forest. And as you can see here, the landscape is now really patchy. Green areas with old-growth forest, they go further and further away from each other because of fragmentation by clear-cutting.
Sweden has about 23 million hectares of productive forest, and then an additional 5 million hectares of unproductive forest. The unproductive forest actually, as the name says, it doesn't produce wood very much. So of the 23 million hectares, about 8 to 10%, depending on how you count, has been set aside for conservation. And the rest is managed for wood production. And this is what it looks like.
But the short-term, profitable clear-cut method of the Swedish model is generally disliked by the general public. So to shift the opinion, persuasion has been launched by the forest industry since the dawn of modern media landscape.
To maintain our advanced position on the pulp and paper market, we have an extensive research activity.
Talking points change over time, and today these PR strategies are more aggressive than ever before. Currently, a number of claims are particularly frequent in the forest industry's marketing and lobbying campaigns. So let's investigate the most common claims, one by one. Old natural forests store huge amounts of carbon in plants and in the ground. Research shows that old-growth forests continue to sequestrate carbon in trees and soil and the mycorrhizal networks. Old forests that are not affected by disturbances contain the greatest carbon stock. Climate crisis awareness rises in society, and consequently one of the forest industry's main talking points is spinned around climate. Let's examine the most common forestry claims related to climate.
Burning forest biomass for fuel is not carbon neutral. When you cut down a tree and burn it for energy in a power plant, it actually emits more CO2 than when you're burning coal. Per megawatt hour, there's actually a lot more CO2 coming out the smokestack when you burn wood. So this is obviously a huge problem. How on earth can we be treating this as instantaneously carbon neutral if it's emitting more CO2 than coal? Well, the idea is that trees will grow back eventually. This is the rationale that the EU is using for treating bioenergy as carbon neutral, essentially. But we don't have that kind of time. We can't wait 50, 100 years for trees to grow back. We need to stop emissions now.
Om vi ska klara 1,5-gradersmålet, Parisavtalet där, så måste vi gå ner kanske 40-45% med utsläppen till 2030. Och bränner vi skogsprodukter så ökar vi utsläppen, vi minskar dem inte.
De organisationer vi har, i det här fallet skogsbolagen då, det ska till ganska mycket för att rubba dem. Så de införlivar i sin regim och sina idéer det som är nytt, det som kommer som förändringskrafter, som klimatfrågan i det här fallet. Vi kan ju se att över tid så har skogspolitiken i vid bemärkelse då överlevt med det här målet att vi är ett råvaruproducerande land. Vi ska producera så mycket det går, vi måste få de här granarna att växa fortare. Men argumenten för det har växlat över tid. Och nu blev det klimatnyttan då, som kom nästan som något positivt.
The future target for Swedish forestry production is to increase the level of production from where we are today, and we think that we will be able to reach a 20% increase until the year 2030.
Om vi avverkar skog och använder det som biobränslen så får vi både utsläpp av koldioxid och minskat upptag av koldioxid. Eftersom vi minskar den gröna ytan, den fotosyntetiserande ytan. Så man gör 2 fel och inte bara 1 fel.
People are watching in horror as forests in the Amazon, in Australia, and in California burn, and they understand immediately that burning forests adds carbon to the atmosphere. But somehow, policymakers have gotten it into their heads that burning forests for fuel actually saves carbon. The regulations and the criteria that the EU put in place going forward for biomass are really kind of Potemkin regulations. They appear to be effective, but in fact they were actually pretty much written by the biomass industry.
In 2018, a letter signed by 800 scientists was sent to the EU.
The letter was put together by a variety of scientists and then signed onto by 800 scientists to ask the EU to dramatically constrain the amount of biomass that's being used for renewable energy in the EU. But unfortunately, they didn't listen. Well, the European Union spent in 2017 over 6.5 billion euro to pay people to cut down trees and burn them in power plants. And that's actually not even the whole amount that was spent when all the subsidies are taken into consideration. So this is absolutely scandalous.
Att man subventionerar denna miljöförstörande pappersindustri med 6-7 miljarder kronor per år för att de ska få billig el. Att man betalar ett halvt öre per kilowattimme istället för 36-37 öre som vanligt folk betalar. Det är ganska skandalöst egentligen.
A common claim for the forest industry's advertising campaigns is that wood can replace energy-intensive materials, the so-called substitution effect. Is this true, and will it save us from climate change?
Det är en myt att den avverkade skogen i Sverige direkt blir klimatsmarta produkter.
När träden växt klart används de till klimatsmarta saker och material.
Ungefär 16% av avverkningen blir sågvirke som kan byggas in i hus då i Sverige eller i andra delar av världen och lagra in kolet under en längre tid. Resten, kanske 80-85%, släpps ut ganska snabbt till atmosfären igen som koldioxid. Och det har ju samma effekt som förbränning av fossila bränslen. Man kan inte skilja på gröna och svarta koldioxidmolekyler. Atmosfären gör ingen skillnad i det fallet.
And besides, how many things are we going to ask forests to provide? So forests are supposed to provide a substitute for fossil fuels. They're supposed to substitute for concrete, steel. We only have so many forests.
Trevlig och vacker skog, men den gör ingen ytterligare klimatnytta.
In the quest for turning natural forests into products, the forest industry often claims that old-growth forests sequestrate less carbon than plantations and therefore should be cut down and replaced.
It's true that young trees do store carbon at a high rate, but old forests already contain a lot of carbon, and cutting old forests and liquidating that carbon represents an enormous emission of carbon to the atmosphere. As well, old forests actually do store a lot of carbon, and the science is clear on this now.
It's just a few years ago that we realized that the mycorrhizal fungi, the dead parts of the hyphae, they contribute significantly to the sequestration of carbon in soil. I mean, in old-growth forests, it's in the range of 40 to 50% of the long-stored carbon that originate for fungi.
På global nivå så står ju de terrestra ekosystemen för ungefär 1/3 av den sänka som finns, det som motverkar så att säga det som hamnar i atmosfären.
Ja, idag så avverkas ju träden när de är relativt unga, men de har ju inte slutat växa, utan en tall kan ju bli 500-600 år gammal och fortsätter att växa då. Och det är inte gjort livscykelanalyser som visar på hur grovt ett träd ska vara för att man ska ur klimatsynpunkt kunna tillåta en avverkning. Men även om det skulle vara så att gammelskogen stannar av, så på grund av att vi har 2030 på oss för att klara 1,5-gradersmålet, så är det fel att avverka dem. För det hinner inte komma upp nya plantor till dess. De hinner inte ta upp kolet. Det är för sent att diskutera på det sättet. Det är en ny tid nu.
The science is conclusive that older forests continue to store carbon for centuries. And this idea that only young forests store carbon is actually an industry myth. The Swedish forestry industry isn't being penalized for the billions of tons of carbon that was locked up in old-growth forests that were scraped away and destroyed for plantations to be put in their place. And now they want to take credit for these young, fast-growing trees as representing carbon sequestration. It's really kind of a shell game where you've got the pea under the shell and you're moving it around. It tricks policymakers, but it doesn't trick the climate.
In addition to CO2 emitted from burning forest products, the clear-cut itself releases even more powerful greenhouse gases.
Ja, kalhyggen läcker ut stora mängder koldioxid och det är det som händer på det här hygget nu de kommande åren. De kritiska åren, om vi ser till IPCC, att vi ska minska då utsläppen med 45% till 2030 och det här kommer ju att fortsätta att läcka då, kanske fram till dess.
Och det är det som vi försöker att få ett bättre grepp på med den här moderna tekniken där vi kan mäta med väldigt hög tidsupplösning. Varje halvtimme så kan vi säga hur mycket koldioxid som har tagits upp eller avgetts från en skog som den här. Och där har vi ju sett också då att de kalhyggen de släpper ut väldigt mycket koldioxid under ganska lång tid.
Så att framförallt marken har ju en stor potential att fortsätta inlagra. Hugger man då ner skogen och gör ett sånt här kalhygge, ja då fortsätter ju, då startar man ju utsläppen momentant. Vi har ju ett årligt utsläpp idag från skogsbruket på kanske 85 miljoner ton koldioxid. Direkta utsläpp. Det är ju då biobränslen som eldas, den här svartluten till exempel. Och det kan ju jämföras då med Sveriges totala övriga utsläpp. Trafik, kommunikation, utrikesflyg inklusive höghöjdseffekt som är på ungefär 63 miljoner ton. Så skogsnäringen i sig har alltså betydligt större utsläpp än vad övriga Sveriges klimatutsläpp är. Varför diskuteras inte det här? Varför rapporteras det inte och så vidare? Jo, faktum är ju att skogen i Sverige fortsätter att ackumulera och vi har en nettoinlagring av kol i Sverige på grund av detta. Men grejen är den att skulle vi inte avverka, då skulle det här upptaget öka ofantligt mycket. Det skulle per satsad krona vara otroligt ekonomiskt försvarsbart jämfört med allting annat och så ska vi lägga om i samhället för att minska utsläppen av växthusgaser. Eftersom det är en sån liten del av ekonomin. Men samtidigt ska Sverige kunna bidra internationellt på ett helt annat sätt än vad vi gör idag.
And in fact, what the climate modeling shows is that the best and highest use of forests is to grow them and restore them and use reforestation and afforestation carefully with natural forests, not plantations, and restore existing forests so that they store more carbon and provide habitat. Because one of the things that seems to be missed in this whole conversation very often is that we're also in the middle of a biodiversity crisis, not just a climate crisis.
Biodiversity is the species, the habitat they live in, and the process that maintains their habitat. Biodiversity is the basis for functioning ecosystems, and functioning ecosystems are the basis for human survival. Therefore, biodiversity loss is considered one of the planetary boundaries. Millions of years of evolution has created the complex ecosystems of natural forests. Most of the biological processes occur through species we usually don't see or think of. Since clear-cut forestry took off in the 1950s, people and scientists have stressed the importance of nature consideration, and consequently the forest industry focuses much of its PR and image creating on that. Important decisions have been made to slow the loss of biodiversity, and experts have pointed out how much we need to protect. From the Aichi targets under the UN's Convention on Biological Diversity to researchers who suggest that half the Earth needs to be excluded from exploitation. Sweden is committed to achieve various UN Aichi targets by 2020. Forestry should ensure biodiversity, and at least 17% of ecologically representative areas must be preserved. According to the forest industry and some politicians in Sweden, we have already protected more than enough. But leading scientists say that Sweden is far from reaching the targets. So what is true?
I took part in a global study about 10 years ago when we compared the retained amount in different countries. And at that time, the Swedish statistics showed that the retained area in Sweden was very low, so we were in the bottom group.
When the international comparison showed Sweden was in the bottom group globally, the influential Swedish forest industry called for new ways to count. And that's what happened. Instead of giving real protection to natural forests, the industry started playing with figures and mixing different concepts to make it look like Sweden has achieved its protection goals.
So now you can also add nature considerations on clear cuts, and you can add low productive areas. Usually they are mires, so raised bogs. So there are two stories, two narratives. One which I would say is correct from a conservation biology point of view, and there is a narrative that wants to maximize how much we don't use for production, but actually not using for production can be interpreted as protected. And of course, if you include more categories, then you have protected more. Creative bookkeeping.
The forest industry claims that more than 30% of the Swedish forests are protected or exempt from forestry. But let's examine their figures deeper. About 6% are so-called consideration on clear cuts. However, most of these areas do not actually exist today. The figure is based on two things. 1. New areas will be set aside to the same extent in the future. 2. Old areas will remain untouched in all future harvesting.
To have this realized in the entire landscape actually takes a rotation time, so it takes 80 or 100 years for this to happen.
16.7% is made up of low-productive, tree-bearing rocky surfaces, mires and bogs. Uninteresting for forestry because they are low-yielding, most of these areas are not included in the formally protected forest land. These lands are not representative of the forest habitats found on productive land and do not have the same high species diversity as productive natural forests.
So it's not honest to include this when you count how much has been protected in Sweden. Then you should focus on the productive areas.
4.3% is an estimate of unprotected so-called voluntary set-aside areas. No comprehensive maps or exact data are available for these areas. This figure is relatively irrelevant since forest owners can set aside forests one day, then change their minds and cut it down the next. The last 3.9% consist of formally protected forest land. So, how much is really protected? If you consider all forest, including low productive forest land and subalpine woodlands, the figure of formally protected forests is 9%. Only 6% of the productive forest land has formal protection, and in the vast majority of Sweden's forest land outside the mountain region, the figure is as low as about 3.5%.
If this is Sweden, it's a tall country. We have the mountains in the north, and below that we have productive forests. And the Convention for Biodiversity talks about setting aside, protecting in some way, 17%. In Sweden, we have, if we look at the situation below the mountains, we have set aside through formal protection and voluntary set-asides about 7 to 9%, depending on the region, which means that there is 8% left. So the gap that we need to fill by landscape restoration would be 8 to 10. Again, Sweden. The Convention of Biodiversity doesn't talk only about numbers, but it talks about functionality. So do patches of voluntary set-aside and formally protected areas actually form a network of habitat that works for species? Of course, this is a very rough estimate. But if you think about what is actually functional, it's very hard to set exact figures, but it's much less. It's a few percent, which means that the gap becomes even bigger. So the challenge now is actually to work with landscape restoration, to recreate habitat and to do this in a spatially explicit way so you maximize functionality.
We set aside 20% of our forest land for nature conservation, and that is in different scales. But the rest of the forest, the 80%, we will use very efficiently and in a long-term sustainable way.
Ser vi till de planer som finns i framtiden, hur skogen ska överföras, så kommer man kanske hamna bortåt 60% som blir monokultur av tall. För södra Sverige så är det ju gran som planteras i monokulturbestånd. Så barrträdsmonokulturer bort mot horisonten. Det krävs snabba åtgärder för att hejda detta.
With today's slow rate of protection and rapid rate of logging, researchers have estimated that virtually all unprotected continuity forests in the northern two-thirds of Sweden will be gone within just a couple of decades. Then we have replaced our natural heritage with biofuels, disposable paper and cardboard.
The Swedish Red List is an assessment of the relative risk of species to go extinct from Sweden. The main reason for species being red-listed is the extensive forestry that we see today, which causes loss of habitats and structures and substrates that the species requires. And basically we see a transformation of ancient woodlands to industrial stands.
Well, it's obvious that the area of more natural, what we call high conservation value forest is too low to secure the forest species in general, and of course in particular those species that are demanding. We can take a look at the development of the Swedish Red List of threatened species, and we can take a look on the national reports to the EU. They all point in the same direction, that the situation is not getting better, it's actually getting worse over time.
The boreal trees, they rely to almost 100% on the mycorrhizal fungi for their nutrient and water uptake. Almost every species we pick in the forest, they are mycorrhizal fungi. And that's due to that they get the sugar from the trees, and thereby they can produce large sporocarps. So we're talking about 2,000 different species, of which the majority are rare. They are to 100% dependent on this symbiosis with the trees. So when the trees are cut, the sugar flow down to the root system and the energy supply to the fungi is cut off. So they disappear. They will survive on the roots of the stumps for about a year, depending on how dry the conditions are, and then they die. So basically clear cutting, when all trees are cut down, results in every single mycorrhizal fungi, all the mycelium, everything that is in the soil is gone. 10% of the ectomycorrhizal species in Sweden, for example, are red-listed, and that's mainly due to clear cutting and that old growth forest that has had the continuity, and where the normally long-lived mycelia of individual species that can stay on the same spot for probably centuries or many centuries, they disappear at the time of clear cutting, and the likeliness for them to re-establish is almost non-existent.
As scientists emphasize the importance of mixed forests and deciduous trees for biodiversity, the forest industry catches on and markets a number of claims. One is that we have more deciduous trees nowadays. If this is true, is it a merit of the forestry?
From the 1950s and until the end of the 1970s, we used herbicides in Sweden, and especially in northern Sweden, on a very large scale. That was connected to the era of the start of the clear cutting. So we used airplane spraying with herbicides, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, in Sweden called Hormoslyr, in North America called Agent Orange. And it was sprayed over enormous areas in northern Sweden just to get rid of the deciduous trees. And when that stopped, the deciduous trees have started to come back again. But as you understand, it's from a very low level. And if we go a little bit further back in time, during the World Wars, a lot of the deciduous forest was cut in northern Sweden, in Sweden in general also, because it was used as fuel wood during the times of fuel scarcity during the wars. Luckily, the deciduous trees are coming back, but they are not at all in the range of what we had earlier in history in Sweden. Some of the most important structures in a forest are the really big trees and the really old trees and the dead wood in different stages.
As the understanding of dead wood's importance for biodiversity increases, the forest industry is quick to follow.
The volume of dead wood in the forest, and now I'm talking more specifically about the northern part of Sweden, it decreased a lot at the beginning of the 1900s. We had very large volumes of dead wood in the forest before the year 1900. We had much, much more dead wood in the forest than we have today. The curve looks like a very advanced slope like this.
So we see in northernmost Sweden we actually have a decline in the volume of dead wood, and a large fraction of the increase of dead wood that happened in the last decade actually was associated with a number of major storm events in southernmost Sweden. That's where we see the main increase. We are now around 8 to 9 cubic meters per hectare, and that is to be compared with perhaps 80 to 100 cubic meters per hectare in a natural forest condition.
And as the forest industry has noticed biologists and scientists emphasizing the importance of old-growth forests for biodiversity, they now also market the idea that we have more old forests than 100 years ago.
When we define old forest today, we are just talking about trees exceeding a certain age. Most of the time we're talking about forests older than 150 years or 160 years or sometimes even 120 years. And that is not an old forest from an ecological perspective. The Scots pine can be up to 1,000 years old. So if we look at the forest from such a perspective, we had much, much more really old forest 100 years ago than we have today. We could also show that the numbers of large trees were much, much higher, and especially when we are talking about really large trees. And of course, the really large trees are most often very old also. We had fairly large numbers of really large trees all over the forest before the exploitation. And if we compare it to today's, we don't even are close to those numbers today.
The Swedish Forest Agency is a national authority responsible for control and review of notions for logging. In a much criticised decision, Herman Sundqvist, a representative of the forestry, was appointed Director General. The agency then stopped conducting inventories of woodland key habitats in northwestern Sweden. Now the agency has declared it will also stop registering key habitats for felling notified forests, a decision heavily criticised even by officials within the agency itself. This basically paves the way for clear-cutting without consideration of indicator species and red-listed species. But the problem doesn't stop there.
Andra typer av påverkan gäller till exempel vattendragen. Stora utsläpp genom dikning, kalhyggen. Den här markberedningen kan ge läckage av kvicksilver, alltså som har deponerats under lång tid och från atmosfäriskt nedfall. Om det görs nära vattendrag kan man få en metylering som påverkar också fisk.
Another problem related to forest floor damage is transport wounds by logging harvesters and forwarders.
Man får sådana här kraftiga körskador, och det här är ju då tillåtet enligt svensk lag. Samtidigt har vi lagstiftning om att man inte får köra med terränggående fordon och skada marken med fyrhjulingar till exempel. Alltså diskrepanser i lagstiftningen som är ganska häpnadsväckande.
Recently, the forest industry started to claim that they no longer clear-cut.
Stora, kala hyggen är inte en del av den svenska skogsbruksmodellen idag. Visst, det går att hitta exempel med rätt kameravinkel och saker.
In an effort to improve public relations, other terms are being used. In 2017, when state-owned forest company Sveaskog clear-cut Brännvinsberget, a unique natural old pine forest, it was called mosaic cutting.
Vi försöker skapa skogar som imorgon är ännu mer rika på biologisk mångfald än vad vi har idag.
Nobody has so far shown that this extensive forestry that we see today is sustainable in the long run. Actually, we have models that show that many species will continue to decline. Nobody has shown that it is a sustainable forestry.
Då det gäller att klara den biologiska mångfalden så har ju olika arter olika behov av bevarat habitat, alltså livsutrymme. Det varierar ju, det kan ju vara upp till 30% eller ner till 10% för olika arter. Och vi har ju redan avverkat de gamla skogarna i stor utsträckning, det finns ju bara några få procent kvar. Så att det handlar ju om restaurering då, av seminaturlig skog tillbaka till naturtillståndet.
If you leave an area and let the deciduous trees come in, you can create new values in a couple of decades. To create old pine trees, which are 350 years, actually takes 350 years. And if you want the deadwood to it, then you have to wait perhaps 500 years.
Biodiverse forests are the basis for many ecosystem services we all depend on. Pollination, soil formation, water regulation and cleansing, climate regulation and carbon storage, air purification, etc. They provide us with food, drinking water and much more.
In both agriculture and forestry, we clear and thin out to ensure better growth. If we didn't do that, the effect would be the reverse.
Lobbyists from the Swedish forestry sometimes claim that forests must be managed and that planted forests deliver the same values and ecosystem services as natural forests. Let's check with the scientists.
90% kalhuggs och planteras. Det ger ju då ökade risker för angrepp av till exempel gremmeniella på tall, rotröta på gran. Alltså det här som kommer att öka om vi får varmare, kanske fuktigare klimat.
So in addition to the obvious benefits that old growth forests provide in terms of carbon storage, which can be massive, and biodiversity, they also are really important for regulation of the water cycle. Forests hold a lot of water and they help release water slowly over time. They protect the soil because they've got a deep litter layer, they haven't been scraped over by equipment.
Förra sommaren så brann det ju en hel del och skulle vi ha haft mer lövträd i border till exempel och bevarat mer våtmarker, haft mindre dikning, så skulle det kunna hejdat en del av de här bränderna.
On a global scale, more frequent and intense wildfires caused by climate change and mismanagement is a huge problem. But a normal frequency of fires is a natural part of boreal forest dynamics. In an effort to defend the practice of clear-cutting, the industry claims that clear-cuts mimic the natural disturbance of wildfires.
There is a very big difference between a clear-cut area and a burned area, and we can see this illustrated very clearly here where we are. After a fire, the amount of dead wood is very, very high. The second thing is that there is usually quite a survival of living trees. And a third thing, after fire, the soil is usually totally black and open for colonization of species.
Blir det så att vi har de här monokulturerna, då kommer de här att slås ut. Det är inte om de kommer att slås ut, utan de kommer att slås ut. Och det ger ju då ett bortfall ekonomiskt för markägaren. Men den motor som kan ta upp koldioxid från atmosfären slås ju också ut. Varför görs det här? Ja, det är ju traditioner, gamla traditioner och hårdnackat motstånd från skogsnäringen till att ändra sig. Fast forskningen visar ju på att vi är fel ute, det som händer idag.
Protected natural forests and an ecosystem-based management means more opportunities for a larger variety of employment and multiple use, such as reindeer husbandry, ecotourism, timber, berry and mushroom harvesting. If forests are managed sustainably and not cut down, they're a great long-term asset to society for generations. The forest industry often claims it is an important part of the economy and job creation.
Swedish timber has created work and wealth in Sweden for a long time. Jobs don't grow on trees, is what people say. But in a way they do in Sweden, thanks to the forestry industry.
So how much does it actually contribute?
Skogsbrukets betydelse för den svenska ekonomin har varit stor, men att det ska fortfarande vara det är en myt. Ungefär 2-3% av BNP i Sverige kommer från skogsnäringen. Intäkterna till skatt för svensk välfärd, om vi räknar bolagsskatt, inkomstskatt, moms, det handlar om cirka 2%. I den siffran ingår inte då skatteintäkter från vinster på aktier, eftersom en stor del av pengarna delas sannolikt ut i aktier. Vi har ju en stor nettoexportintäkt. Det handlar om drygt 100 miljarder kronor per år. Men det märkliga är att någonstans på vägen försvinner de här pengarna. Om man räknar då bort elsubventionerna så blir det alltså ett fåtal miljarder som kommer in till svensk välfärd. Ser man till arbetstillfällena så handlar det om ungefär 1,4% av de anställda i Sverige arbetar inom hela skogssektorn. Ungefär 70 000 personer av nära 5 miljoner personer. Av dessa 70 000 personer så är det ungefär 16 000 personer som faktiskt arbetar ute i skogen. Resten arbetar då i industri och sågverk. Och 16 000 personer det motsvarar ungefär de kommunanställda i en större svensk stad. Så att tidigare var ju skogsbruket viktigt för landsbygden då man hade anställda som jobbade med motorsågar och så. Men nu är ju det här bortrationaliserat. Sen har vi ju också andra verksamheter i skogen då, som påverkas. Där vi nu står det är ju renbetesmarker. Här var det renar i vintras och sen har man markberett och en stor del av laven är ju borta, marklaven. De är beroende av den här laven för sitt bete. Och man räknar på att sen man började med det här kalhyggesbruket och plantageskogsbruket så har någonstans 30-50% av vinterbeteslandet för ren gått till spillo.
Forestry also helps to preserve significant natural and cultural values and creates opportunities for indigenous peoples to live and work.
De här skogarna i norr är ju bland de sista resterna av en tidigare europeisk skogstäcke och det skulle ju finnas förutsättningar för naturturism. Men desto mer man avverkar och omvandlar skogar till plantager, desto sämre blir ju de förutsättningarna. Om man ser till sysselsättningen inom turistnäringen i Sverige så är den ju större än sysselsättningen inom skogssektorn. Man har också ungefär likartad andel av BNP. Så det här är ju en framtidsbransch egentligen som förstörs och på ett sådant sätt som ger stora miljöskador och klimatpåverkan.
Multiple studies show that being in forests is highly beneficial for physical and mental health. Natural old-growth forests are perceived as beautiful with their biodiversity, natural water streams and old trees. While dense managed tree stands or clear cuts are perceived as uninviting. Consequently, forestry advertisements often portray Swedish forestry with happy people in beautiful old-growth forests, hardly reflecting the reality of Sweden's industrial tree farm-dominated landscape.
So this forest we see here, it looks, there's moss on the ground, there are big trees, but they are in straight lines, which indicates that they were planted. Society's valuation of forests changes over time, and of course, when the forest industry started to grow, there was lots of wood in the forest, the market was not saturated, and actually this went on until the 1950s. So Swedish industry has been very, very good and clever at making use of this wood, doing value-added products, and this is the strategy still today. But now society's values have changed, and we want more. And actually, when you look at the general citizen, they rank wood production, and especially energy wood, very, very low. They want recreation, they want biodiversity, they want a nice forest to be in. And not even having to go there, because it's just the value that it exists is important to people.
So consequently, the forest industry strives to shift this attitude and spends millions on targeting the general public when promoting forestry and forest products as something desirable.
Deforestation is a large problem. That's not the case in Sweden. Man kan till och med göra smink av skog.
Swedish forest, where the future grows for a sustainable future.
Swedish forest, where the future grows.
In an effort to sell the Swedish forestry model as sustainable, the forest industry often claims we have more forest than ever.
Is there any danger that we will run out of forest? No.
How is this possible when more forest is logged and the timber production has increased?
When we discuss how the forest has changed in Sweden, we use the National Forest Inventory. And that started in 1923, and it was published in 1932.
The National Forest Inventory began 60, 70 years, even more, after intensive forest management began in some parts of Sweden. Then in the Boreal, actually, The wood volume has now come back to the situation in the 1850s. So those who say that the wood volume has increased, that there was lots of felled forest a long time ago, for the boreal forest, this is not true.
The 1920s is a time when we have had a commercial exploitation of the forest for a long time, and when we built up this forest industry, especially in northern Sweden. So we had much more forest before 1920. 1850 we had one of the richest forests in terms of all trees and timber volume in all of Europe.
Och då tänker vi ur ett historiskt perspektiv så hade vi nästan avskogat Sverige på 1850-talet.
We had very old forest. We had forest with very large Scots pine trees. The trees could be up to 500-600 years of age at that time. And this was an accumulated forest resource that had been growing for many hundreds of years and had developed and was at that time accessible for the sawmill industry in northern Sweden.
So it seems like a forest industry myth that we have more forest now than ever. But to examine the industry claims further, we need to ask ourselves again, what is a forest?
Då man diskuterar sådana här frågor, då är det viktigt att ha klart för sig nomenklaturen, alltså vad man menar. Och i Sverige så brukar man dela in trädbevuxna områden i, man kallar det för kulturskog och naturskog. Och det här stämmer inte med den internationella indelningen. För att internationellt så delar man in i 3 olika huvudtyper av trädbevuxna områden. Det är naturskog, seminaturlig skog och plantager. I Sverige pratar man inte om plantager, trots att vi har plantager. Och vi i Sverige ser lite snett på till exempel i Sydostasien där man anlägger oljepalmsplantager, eller i Brasilien man anländer eukalyptusplantager. Men vi gör precis samma sak. Men på något sätt kommer man undan med att kalla det här för kulturskog. Vi har alltså plantager i Sverige. Och att ha det här klart för sig, de negativa effekterna, det är enormt viktigt.
A managed forest in Sweden has 2 species of trees, long needles and short needles, so Scots pine and Norway spruce. The space for species in a natural forest is very large, but the space for species in a managed forest is very small.
But now we are moving into a situation where we are actually starting to clear-cut forest which were clear-cut once in the past. We don't have much forest left which has never been clear-cut, so we are losing that component in the forest landscape.
A common slogan to reinforce a sustainable image of Swedish forestry is "We plant more trees than we cut down."
Skogen planterar minst 2 nya träd för varje som avverkas.
And 3 new trees are planted for every 1 cut down.
2 saplings are being planted for every tree that is cut down.
Metoden för detta, det är ju att man kalavverkar, markbereder. Sen köper man in plantor som är från växthus då, i pots och sätter dem i rader. Efter 10 år ungefär så röjer man bort de naturligt föryngrade träden ner till 10% ungefär. Och därför så är det rimligt att också räkna de här monokulturerna i Sverige, barrträdsmonokulturerna, för vad det är, trädplantager.
So planted seedlings are not planted to build a new forest, but to create a tree stand that can be harvested again as soon as possible. And even as an industrial stand, the claimed figures are highly exaggerated, since a large portion of the planted seedlings are soon removed by thinning. This claim was spread during the World Economic Forum.
It's only during the last about 50 years that we really have been doing extensive planting of forest in Sweden and in northern Sweden. Before that, most of the regeneration was natural regeneration, just trees felling their seeds and you got trees from that. So that is absolutely not true.
Apart from traditional marketing and lobbying, the forest industry has realized the value of funding and controlling research projects.
Då måste vi liksom trimma Volvon så att vi ökar skogens tillväxt. Här har vi turbon.
Professor Eric Westholm was a part of Future Forests, the biggest forest research program in Swedish history, and afterwards made a critical case study of it.
2010 var jag på världsskogskongressen i Buenos Aires och blev helt förbluffad över vilken enorm oro det var kring skogarna i Australien och Medelhavet och Kanada och USA. Varenda session nästan började ju med klimatadress. Och det var inte alls vanligt från Sverige. Vi hade ju i Future Forest var det ju liksom, ja men om det blir 4 grader varmare på jorden och vi får en gödslingsvänlig politik.
Mer av sådana här turboträd på hyggena framöver, gärna i kombination med gödsling.
Så kan vi producera mycket mera skog och vi skulle kunna öka exportinkomsterna med flera miljarder. Jag har ju varit likadant på Skogs- och lantbruksakademin länge. Och det finns ju en väldigt tät allians mellan skogsfakulteten på Lantbruksuniversitetet och skogsindustrin. Det är ju som en kultur till stöd för den inriktning på volymökning som har dominerat i Sverige, fast med olika argument. Det som blev allt mer klart för mig var ju att det här programmet hade kommit till för att ställa till rätta den skogliga agendan i Sverige. Och den handlar ju om att få ett ökad legitimitet och ökat politiskt stöd för den svenska skogsproduktionsinriktningen och ändå med på mer intensivodlad skog. Det fanns en viss maktkamp i början om inflytandet här mellan Mistra, den statliga finansiären och skogsbolagen om styrelseplatser. För styrelse här inne var också en viss makt över vad som gjordes i projektet. Man hade pengar i styrelsen som man kunde lägga ut på vissa beställningar och sådär. Så på det viset kom ju forskningen också styras inte utav forskningsmotiv eller vetenskapliga motiv utan utav intressen hos finansiärerna. Då kan man fråga sig hur alla de här forskarna liksom ställer upp på en sån sak. Men den var faktiskt ganska dold. I framtidsstudierna så pratar man ofta om en metod som heter backcasting. Man talar om vart man vill nå och sen går forskningsprocessen ut på att kartlägga hur man ska komma dit. Men det här målet var ju inte öppet kommunicerat. Att forskarna vet inte själva att programmet har ett mål som är överenskommet med finansiärerna. Universitetet var ett sätt att nå det här ökade stödet för den svenska skogsproduktionen. Det finns en väldig kraft att vi ska inte ändra på någonting och om vi ska ändra på någonting så är det bara att öka speeden hela tiden i skogsproduktionen. Det är volym som har gällt.
Another picture of the Swedish forestry model has emerged. Since 1950, it has converted more than 60% of the Swedish forest landscape into clear-cuts, young managed forests, industrial stands and plantations. In the past, it has sprayed Agent Orange to kill deciduous trees, destroyed countless streams, put many plants, animals and fungi on the red list, while marketing its own methods as sustainable. This industry now claims it is motivated not by profit, but by concern for climate change. It seems to be one of the greatest lies of our time. Forestry needs to be reformed. The Swedish clear-cutting and plantation model replaced by ecosystem-based multiple use, which will provide a greater variety of benefits, jobs, and contribute more to our society than today's unsustainable forest exploitation.
We're losing so much and so quickly. And I think that there's going to be a real pushback on the traditional lobbyist talking points about how we have to cut the forest to save it and that we're going to replace everything with all these products with wood. People can do the math themselves. They can figure out that we only have a little bit of these precious forest heritage left. Old growth forests are our best defense against the climate. We have to stop cutting them and we have to start really protecting them.
And this is why it's important to maintain the last pieces of naturally dynamic forest and also to begin restoring. And actually the boreal forest is quite a good place to do that.
Om konsumtionen fortsätter att öka så kommer ju också, vi måste öka produktionen och utsläppen fortsätter att öka. Inom ekonomin brukar man kalla det här för Jevons paradox. Vissa miljöproblem som handlar om resursanvändning går inte att lösa tekniskt. Det går inte att lösa med ökad produktion. Det som också skulle behövas, det är ju naturligtvis för att få det här till stånd, att skadliga subventioner dras in. Vi skulle behöva dämma igen dikerna, få mer våtmarker. Om vi ser på utsläppen från dikad skogsmark i Sverige, det handlar om ungefär nära 6 miljoner ton koldioxid per år. Det kan ju jämföras med från biltrafiken då på ungefär 10 miljoner ton koldioxid per år. Och detta kan åtgärdas ganska enkelt. Så att, det finns handfasta, enkla metoder att faktiskt göra skillnad.
People need to stand up to the forest products industry, and they need to stand up to the politicians who are enthralled to the forest products industry. When they're marching in the streets for climate, they need to be marching for forests as well.
Nu tickar klockan så att säga. Vi har bara en kort tid på oss och därför så faller det gamla resonemanget. Vi måste ändra helt enkelt diskussionen till den akuta situationen vi har. Om vi fortsätter över 1,5 graders målet mot 2-3 grader, då kan vi riskera att komma över gränser där naturen börjar generera växthusgaser av sig själv utan att vi har kontroll över det hela. Man passerar så kallade tipping points. Dynamiken går över mot förstärkt växthuseffekt av sig själv. Då är det för sent. Och därför så måste skogsbruket helt enkelt i Sverige och världen ändra inställning. Och det är snabbt så att säga. Om man tänker fortfarande att skogen växer tillbaks, ja men det är om 100 år. Då är det för sent.
Who are you going to trust on climate? The forest products industry or the IPCC? Personally, I would trust the scientists. The IPCC has made it clear that restoring and expanding forests is our best hope for fighting climate change, in addition, of course, to dramatic reductions in emissions. We all have to learn to use less, and we have to leave the forests in place to provide a home for animals, plants, and the rest of life on Earth. And if we don't, we're going to learn that we're really sorry.